Imagine a battlefield where the only weapon is the womb, and victory is not measured in territory gained, but in the fragile first heartbeats of an heir. Picture a gilded cage, a palace of breathtaking luxury, where the air, thick with incense and whispers of intrigue, carries an unspoken biological imperative. This was the world of the royal consort, a world where a woman's body was not her own, but a vessel for the ambitions of an empire. Her value, decreed not by her wit or her will, but by the brutal arithmetic of dynastic survival. For these women, the crown was both a prize and a curse. Their bodies, celebrated in public ceremony and immortalized in official portraiture, became private crucibles of pain, enduring an endless cycle of pregnancy and childbirth. This was the silent, solemn transaction at the heart of monarchy, their flesh for a future, their suffering for stability, their very lifeblood for the continuation of a name. They were the biological engines of empire. Their personal griefs and physical agonies dismissed as the necessary, unglamorous cost of power. But this is not merely a story of numbers of 15, 18, or even 23 pregnancies. To count the births is to miss the point entirely. This is a story about the unseen cost of the crown, about the profound psychological weight borne by women who were mothers to nations, yet were often forbidden to be mothers to their own children. We will journey beyond the pristine marble of their monuments and the stoic gazes of their portraits to uncover a hidden history of endurance, of ferocious political maneuvering born from maternal instinct, and of human sacrifice on a scale few can comprehend. We will tell the stories of the forgotten wounds that bore the weight of every empire. Before the iron decree of duty, before the cold calculus of succession, there was a semblance of peace, a fragile quietude that existed in the sun-drenched gardens and private chambers of Europe's noble houses. Consider the world of a young German princess, Sophia Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, in the middle of the 18th century. Her life, at first glance, was an idyll of carefully cultivated privilege. The hours were marked not by hardship, but by the gentle discipline of her tutors and the soft, crystalline melodies she coaxed from the harpsichord under her diligent fingers. She studied botany, her mind genuinely captivated by the intricate, silent logic of petals and leaves, a world of predictable growth and beauty. She read poetry in French and Italian, her heart stirred by tales of chivalric romance and classically rendered sorrows, things that felt distant and safely confined to the printed page. This was her world, a bubble of order, refinement, and what she perceived to be safety, protected within the high stone walls of her family's provincial estate. But even in this gilded cage, the bars were ever present, merely veiled by the silken draperies of politeness and courtly protocol. Her education, though impressively broad, was meticulously curated for a single, overarching purpose. She learned the languages of Europe's great courts, not for the love of literature, but for the stark utility of future diplomacy and marital negotiation. She was taught art history, not to immerse herself in the transcendent power of beauty, but to recognize the complex heraldry and dynastic lineages of potential allies and powerful rivals. The very portraits of her ancestors, somber and imposing in their dark frames lining the halls, were more than just decoration. They were silent judges, their painted eyes a constant, solemn reminder of the rarefied blood that flowed in her veins and the immense unspoken expectations that came with it. Every lesson in etiquette, every piece of memorized music, every gracefully executed curtsy was a rehearsal for a role she was born to play, a role she had not chosen, that of a royal consort. She was being polished, not for her own edification, but to become a flawless jewel in another's crown. And in the summer of 1761, when she was just 17 years old, the summons came, an official offer of marriage from the most powerful Protestant man in the world, the newly crowned King George III of Great Britain. It was presented by her trembling family as an unparalleled honor, a divine providence, but it was, in its stark, unvarnished reality, a supreme political calculation. The young British king, insecure in his new reign, urgently needed a wife, a Protestant queen of good breeding to secure the Hanoverian line and quell any lingering whispers of Jacobite sympathies. Charlotte, with her impeccable lineage, her reputation for gentle obedience, and her convenient political obscurity, was deemed the perfect asset. Her personal happiness, her dreams, her quiet love for botany, they were all irrelevant footnotes in the grand contract of state as she boarded the royal yacht that would carry her to England, leaving behind the only world she had ever known. She was sailing toward a destiny that would be defined not by her passions or her intellect, but by the clinical performance of her fertility. The salt spray on her face felt like a final, clean wash of her girlhood, each nautical mile pulling her further from the girl she had been and closer to the function she was to become. She, like every royal woman before and after her, was about to become deeply indebted to a force far more powerful and unforgiving than any single monarch. This force had no face, no voice, yet its chilling presence was felt in every tense council chamber, every strategic marriage negotiation, and every whispered prayer for a male heir. It was the great, hungry specter of the crown's demand, the relentless, insatiable, and existential need for continuity. A king without a son, or at the very least, a clear line of succession, was a monarch ruling on borrowed time. His kingdom was a house built on sand, perpetually vulnerable to the violent storms of civil war and the predatory ambitions of foreign opportunists. The War of the Austrian Succession, a conflict that had torn Europe apart just a decade prior, was a fresh and bloody lesson in the chaos that erupts when a throne's future is uncertain. The crown's demand was a creditor that never slept, and its currency was human. Its price was paid in the blood of soldiers on the battlefield, and it was paid in the cloistered birthing chambers of queens, the lifeblood of the kingdom. It was believed, flowed directly from the fragile vessel of the queen's body. The health of the nation was thus inextricably, terrifyingly linked to the functions of her womb. Nowhere in history was this terror more palpable, more physically manifest than within the sprawling, interwoven and tragically decaying dynasty of the Habsburgs in the 16th century for generations, a policy of relentless and calculated inbreeding, intended to consolidate power and hoard territory within the family, had turned their noble bloodline into a genetic prison. Their mighty legacy was stalked by physical and mental frailties that became legendary in their horror. They were haunted by debilitating epilepsy, crippling bouts of melancholy, and the infamous prognathism, the protruding, deformed Habsburg jaw that made even the simple act of chewing a painful, lifelong ordeal. The dynasty was, as one contemporary papal envoy morbidly observed, a house that is slowly consuming itself from the inside out. Into this gilded crucible of genetic decay stepped a young woman named Anna of Bohemia and Hungary. When she was married at the age of 18 to her cousin, the future Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand I, she was more than just a bride. She was a desperate gamble, a potential cure. Her relatively diverse genetic background, free from the immediate taint of the most concentrated Habsburg blood, was seen by the Viennese court as an infusion of new life, a last, desperate hope to cleanse the stagnant imperial bloodline. The pressure upon her was therefore immense and immediate, a silent weight in the very air she breathed. Court physicians, their faces grim and pitilessly analytical, assessed her not as a young woman on the cusp of a new life, but as a veterinarian might assess prized livestock. They were, in essence, human husbandmen, tasked with the grim duty of cultivating the blighted royal stock, the entire weight of European stability, the future of the Holy Roman Empire, and the continuation of the most powerful house in Christendom seemed to rest upon the unseen, unknown capabilities of this one woman's reproductive system. Her personal desires, her fears, her very identity were rendered utterly secondary to her biological function. She was a vessel, and her emptiness was a matter of international crisis. And so, the great impersonal engine of the state focuses its awesome, crushing power on the most intimate and intensely personal of all human experiences, the act of giving birth. This is the moment the abstract demand becomes a visceral, bloody reality, the point of no return, where a woman's body is conscripted for the service of history. Imagine now Eleanor of Castile, a Spanish princess betrothed in 1254 to the formidable heir to the English throne, the future Edward I. She was just 13 years old, a child, traded like a precious commodity in a political pact designed to settle territorial disputes between England and Castile. She was given to a warrior prince, a man whose reputation was already being forged in brutal, baronial wars and would later be cemented on the battlefields of the Crusades. Hers was not to be a life of comfort and courtly leisure. It was a constant, grueling procession across rugged terrain. Living in drafty tents and provisional castles, as she dutifully accompanied her husband on his relentless military and administrative campaigns. Her first childbirth, therefore, was not an event of serene maternal joy. Sheltered in a loving home, it was a stark, clinical, and terrifyingly public ordeal. Surrounded by the grim, anxious faces of midwives and physicians whose primary concern was not for her survival, but for the successful delivery of a potential heir. In a cold stone chamber, the air thick with the smell of medicinal herbs and fear, the child queen endured her labor. Every spasm of pain that racked her small frame was scrutinized. Every cry she uttered analyzed for signs of weakness or progress. Outside the heavy oak door, knights and nobles waited, their hushed, impatient whispers a constant, terrifying reminder that this intensely private agony was, in fact, a public spectacle of the highest order. The king's concern, however deep his youthful affection for her may have been, was entirely overshadowed by his royal, dynastic need. When at last, after hours of torment, the infant's cry, thin and reedy, finally pierced the tense silence, it was a sound of profound relief for the entire court. It was the sound of succession, the sound of stability, the sound of a political victory. But for Eleanor, lying exhausted and bleeding on the birthing bed, that first cry was something else entirely. It was the sharp, metallic clink of the first link in a chain that would bind her for the rest of her life. With the birth of her first daughter, her own girlhood was definitively, brutally over. Her function was confirmed. Her fate was sealed. The cycle, relentless and voracious, had begun. Once the first chain is forged, hammered into place by the cry of a newborn, the life of a queen is irrevocably altered. The initial reaction to this stark new reality is rarely one of open rebellion, for rebellion is a luxury such women cannot afford, a fire that would consume them before it ever threatened the stone walls of the patriarchy. Instead, the first response is one of adaptation, a desperate and often brilliant attempt to carve out a space for the self within the unyielding, crushing confines of duty. After the raw, visceral terror of the first birth recedes, a new, numbing rhythm begins to assert itself. The queen learns to navigate her world, a world in which her own body has become a public ledger, its most intimate cycles and capabilities a subject of state council and diplomatic whisper. This is the intricate, exhausting art of royal survival, and few mastered the public performance of this art with such outward grace, while concealing such private torment as Queen Charlotte, having arrived in the imposing, alien world of the British court as a 17-year-old girl. She quickly and intelligently understood that her life was now a permanent performance on a grand stage. She responded not by withdrawing into terrified passivity, but by seizing absolute control of the only domain truly allotted to her, the domestic sphere. With a quiet, ferocious determination, Charlotte transformed the royal household into her personal fortress, a meticulously ordered bastion against the chaotic pressures of the court and the relentless demands on her body. With 15 pregnancies unfolding over 21 grueling years, her physical form was almost perpetually conscripted by the state, but her formidable mind and will focused with an intense, almost manic energy on creating an ordered, insulated world for her children. She did not merely oversee the royal nurseries, she commanded them. She became a matriarch of microscopic, exacting detail. She championed the controversial and brave new science of inoculation against smallpox for her children, facing down the superstitious fears of the court. She personally vetted tutors, approved lesson plans, and fostered a family life that was, by the cold, distant standards of European royalty, astonishingly intimate and tight-knit. This was her intricate coping mechanism to pour all of her considerable intelligence and restless energy into the role of the perfect mother, the perfect wife, the perfect, unimpeachable queen consort. It was an act of profound psychological self-preservation, a way to find meaning and exert agency in a life that was otherwise defined by a singular, repetitive biological function. Her private apartments became a sanctuary of art, music, and botany, a space where she could be the woman who loved Mozart rather than just the woman who produced heirs. Yet, the gilded facade, no matter how perfectly constructed and maintained, was still a prison in a moment of unguarded honesty, captured in the intimate privacy of a personal letter. The carefully held mask slips, revealing the profound, bone-deep weariness beneath. "I don't think," she wrote in a fine, spidery hand while heavily pregnant with her 14th child, "a prisoner could wish more ardently for his liberty than I wish to be rid of my burden." The words hang in the air across the centuries, a testament to the silent anguish of a woman who fulfilled her duty flawlessly, yet privately, desperately, yearned for the simple, elemental freedom of owning her own body. But what happens when this fortress of domestic order, so carefully built as a defense against the world, is breached from within? What is the psychological toll when the duty is fulfilled, when the birthing bed is once again survived, but the reward a living, breathing child is cruelly, capriciously snatched away by fate? The ordered world of Queen Charlotte, while physically grueling, was largely spared this deepest of horrors for other queens. However, the cycle of duty did not just become burdensome, it escalated into a recurring, waking nightmare. The initial, sharp terror of childbirth began to pale in comparison to the chilling, silent, and far more enduring terror that followed it in the specter of the empty cradle, the grief that has no name. We must return to Eleanor of Castile, the child bride who evolved into a seasoned, stoic queen. Her life did not settle into a comfortable rhythm of successful maternity. Instead, it became a relentless, soul-crushing war of attrition against the staggering rates of infant mortality. Of the 16 children she bore for her beloved Edward and for the future of England, only 6 would survive to adulthood 10 times. 10 times she endured the hope of pregnancy, the months of physical discomfort, and the life-threatening agony of labor, only to then endure the unique, hollowing, silent grief of burying her own child. Imagine, if you can, the psychological landscape of such an existence. It is a terrain of perpetual, low-grade dread, the joy of a new birth, the sound of a healthy cry, must have been immediately and inevitably tempered by a cold, creeping fear. Every subsequent cough from the royal nursery, every slight feverish brow, would have sent a shock of pure, unadulterated panic through her. The court, once jubilant at the news of a birth, would learn to fall into a practiced, somber pattern of whispers and prayers as another royal infant weakened, faded, and died. For Eleanor, this was not a political setback or a dynastic inconvenience. It was a deeply personal, repeated trauma that carved itself into her very soul. We see the evidence of this immense, almost unfathomable grief, etched not in diaries or letters, for her sorrow was too profound for such expression, but in cold, hard stone. Upon her own death decades later, her devastated husband, King Edward I, commanded the construction of 12 monumental crosses, the famous Eleanor crosses, to mark each overnight stop of her funeral procession from Lincoln to Westminster Abbey. History remembers these as monuments to one of the great royal love stories, a testament to a king's adoration for his queen. But they are something more, something darker and more profound. They are silent, towering testaments to a shared, unimaginable grief. They are a king's desperate attempt to give tangible, monumental form to a pain that was private, maternal, and formless. Each intricately carved cross is not just a marker of her final journey. It stands as an unspoken, colossal headstone for the 10 children she had lost along the way. Standing before one today, one can almost feel the weight of that loss. A king's attempt to fight an intangible enemy like death itself, with the only weapons he had: wealth, power, and stone. Her body had built an empire's future, but her heart was a graveyard of its lost and forgotten children. Is there, then, a tragedy greater than a mother burying her children time and time again? Is there a deeper, more horrific level to this inferno of royal duty? There is. It is the shocking, cruel revelation that even absolute, unequivocal success in this grim task offers no protection, no reward, no guarantee of survival. It is the moment a queen realizes that after fulfilling her purpose to perfection, her own life is not a prize to be cherished, but the final, disposable payment on a debt she never consciously incurred. This was the horrifying truth revealed by the life and the death of Anna of Bohemia and Hungary, the woman who had been hailed as the genetic savior of the mighty Habsburgs. Against all odds, against the tide of history and genetic decay, she had triumphed. Where other queens had faced a litany of loss, Anna succeeded on a scale that seemed nothing short of miraculous. An astonishing 13 of her 15 children survived to adulthood. Her healthy, vibrant blood had indeed revitalized the ailing, stagnant dynasty. Her children were a testament to her success. They spread across the continent, becoming kings, queens, powerful bishops, and influential duchesses, weaving a new, stronger, more resilient Habsburg web over the whole of Europe. She had done it. She had single-handedly defeated the twin specters of infertility and infant mortality that had haunted her husband's house. She had given the empire everything it demanded of her, and more. In the cold winter of 1547, at the age of 43, a veteran of the birthing chamber, Anna went into labor with her final child. It was expected to be a routine event for a woman whose body had proven so capable, so miraculously resilient. But the delivery was difficult, long, and in the exhausted hours that followed, a insidious enemy revealed itself, one that no amount of royal fortitude or past success could fight. A fever began to rage through her body, the dreaded septic fire of puerperal fever, the invisible pestilence that turned the sanctuary of the birthing chamber into a death chamber. The physicians, who had once praised her as the hope of the empire, now stood by, helpless. Their arcane remedies and desperate prayers utterly useless. Her husband Ferdinand, a man known for his stern, imperial composure, was shattered, reduced to a weeping, powerless husband. Within days, Anna of Bohemia, the woman who had birthed an entire generation of rulers, was dead. This was the ultimate, most terrifying revelation. Her body, having completed its great historic work, was now broken and expendable. The dynasty was secure. But the vessel that had secured it was cast aside, a shattered instrument. Anna's death sent a chilling, unambiguous message to every royal woman in Europe. Your success does not earn you safety. It merely fulfills your contract. The crown's demand, having received its payment in full, had finally, mercilessly, claimed the croupier as well. There is a sacrifice of the body, and there is a sacrifice of the soul. We have witnessed the quiet, private agonies, the grueling cycles of pregnancy, the gnawing grief of child loss, even the final, ultimate payment of a queen's life, like that of Anna of Bohemia, given in exchange for dynastic survival. But what happens when this sacrifice is no longer a private sorrow, whispered about in darkened court corridors? What happens when a woman's personal tragedy is not mourned and forgotten, but is instead seized, magnified, and monumentalized, transmuted into a spectacle for the entire world to gaze upon for all time? This is the story's great turning point. It is the moment the suffering of the royal womb ceases to be a political secret and becomes a public monument, an irreversible act that changes the very nature of the narrative. This transformation is embodied in the fate of one woman and in the gleaming white structure born from her death. In the heart of the 17th century Mughal Empire, a domain of almost unimaginable wealth and splendor, lived a queen known as Mumtaz Mahal, born Arjumand Banu Begum into the Persian nobility. She was married to the emperor, Shah Jahan. Theirs was not the cold, transactional union common to so many royal houses. By all accounts, it was a partnership of genuine love, mutual respect, and intellectual intimacy. Mumtaz was not merely a consort confined to the zanana, the secluded women's quarters. She was Shah Jahan's most trusted confidant, his chief advisor, a constant presence at his side in court and even on grueling military campaigns. Her political acumen was as valued as her beauty. Yet, despite this elevated status, she could not escape the fundamental, inexorable duty of her position. Over 19 years of marriage, her body was commanded to produce 14 children. A relentless cycle that occurred alongside her duties as a political counselor and campaign companion. The constant state of pregnancy, the cumulative exhaustion, and the grief for the 7 children who did not survive infancy took a visible, silent toll. It was her 14th and final childbirth. However, that proved fatal. In the field, on campaign, She was subjected to 30 agonizing hours of labor. The ordeal ended with her death from a postpartum hemorrhage at the age of just 38. Her devastated husband's grief was epic, a force that plunged the entire empire into mourning. Shah Jahan, the ruler of the world, withdrew from public life, his hair reportedly turning white overnight. But his sorrow did not dissipate. Instead, it underwent a strange and terrible alchemy. His private pain calcified into a monumental public obsession. He would immortalize her. He would build her a tomb so perfect, so divine, that the world itself would never forget his love, nor her sacrifice. For over 2 decades, the resources of an empire were marshaled to erect the Taj Mahal. It is a structure that seems to float, a vision of white marble and precious stones that still stuns the world with its sublime beauty. It is called a monument to love, but it is something more complex, more troubling. It is the ultimate objectification of a woman's life and death. Her identity as a brilliant advisor, a beloved companion, was subsumed by her final act dying in childbirth. The Taj Mahal is the most beautiful, most famous tombstone ever placed upon the altar of female sacrifice, forever enshrining the idea that a queen's greatest legacy is born from her suffering. Her body was consumed, and in its place, an icon was left for the world to admire. The personal was now irrevocably public. This very act of being objectified, of being reduced to a beautiful tragedy, a silent monument, or a cautionary tale, can forge an unexpected and dangerous reaction in the crucible of a royal court. When a woman sees that piety, duty, and even love lead only to her own erasure, she may learn a different lesson. Instead of breaking her spirit, the fire of injustice can temper it into a blade of cold, hard steel. This hardening of the soul, this chilling realization that passivity leads to oblivion, gives rise to a new archetype, the queen who refuses to be a victim. The queen who decides that if the world is a brutal game of power, she will become a master player. This transformation is personified in the politically ferocious figure of Maria Carolina of Naples and Sicily, the daughter of the formidable Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and the sister of the ill-fated Marie Antoinette. Maria Carolina was born into the very heart of European power politics. At just 15, she was married off to King Ferdinand IV of Naples, a man she openly loathed, considering him an imbecilic and brutish lout. Her duty, however, was clear. It was a cold, calculated act of statecraft from the very beginning. She carried out this duty with a chilling efficiency, bearing a staggering 17 children. But for Maria Carolina, these children were not simply objects of maternal affection. They were assets. They were weapons. The execution of her sister, Marie Antoinette, during the French Revolution served as the defining, radicalizing event of her life. It crystallized her worldview. The world was a brutal, chaotic place, and the only true defense was absolute power, ruthlessly applied. Her grief did not turn inward, like Shah Jahan's. It turned outward, into a burning, implacable rage. Maria Carolina transformed her court into a war room and her nursery into an arsenal. She pored over maps and lineage charts, treating her surviving sons and daughters like battalions to be deployed across the chessboard of Europe. Each strategic marriage was a political maneuver designed to forge alliances, isolate enemies, and consolidate her own influence. She became one of the most outspoken and formidable opponents of Napoleon Bonaparte, her hatred for the French revolutionaries a driving force in her life. Her maternal ambition became utterly indistinguishable from raw political power. The Queen's chamber was no longer just a birthing room. It was the command center of a dynasty at war. She had learned the brutal lesson of her time to survive. A queen could not afford to be just a mother. She had to be a general. But what if, after all of this struggle, after the quiet endurance of a Charlotte, the monumental grief of an Eleanor, the political ferocity of a Maria Carolina, the end result is still nothing? What if the fundamental antagonist of this story, biology itself, simply refuses to cooperate, rendering all sacrifice, all strategy, all suffering utterly and completely meaningless? This is the ultimate nadir, the story's lowest point, a tragedy so complete it borders on the absurd. It is the story of Queen Anne of Great Britain. Her life represents the absolute, categorical failure of the entire system's purpose. Here, all the strategies of survival are rendered impotent, and the Queen is left with nothing but the ashes of her own body's betrayal. The numbers themselves are a litany of horror that defies comprehension. Over a period of 16 years, Queen Anne endured 18 pregnancies. Let that number settle. 18 times. She faced the hope and the terror, the physical ordeal that was a royal birth, 18 times. The kingdom held its breath. And 18 times, hope was extinguished. The cycle became a continuous, looping nightmare of a kind that surpasses all others. It was not just the single, sharp shock of a fatal childbirth, nor the recurring grief of losing some children among many. For Anne, it was a relentless, unbroken pattern of devastation. Miscarriages that left her bleeding and weak, stillbirths that delivered only silence, infants who lived for mere hours, days, or weeks, just long enough for a desperate, fragile attachment to form before being snuffed out. Modern historians now believe she may have suffered from Hughes's syndrome, a blood disorder that causes clotting and turns the womb into a hostile environment. But for Anne, there was no diagnosis, only the evidence of failure again and again. The centerpiece of this lifelong tragedy, the blow from which she never recovered, was the death of her only child to survive infancy. Prince William, Duke of Gloucester. He was the hope of the nation, the sole Protestant heir of the Stuart line. And at the age of just 11, after a short, sudden illness, he died. With his death, the future of a dynasty died with him. This was the point of no return for Anne's spirit. Her later years were a portrait of physical and emotional decay. Racked by gout and other ailments, she grew obese and was often confined to a wheelchair, carried to Parliament to perform her duties. She was, by all accounts, a powerful and effective monarch. She oversaw the 1707 Act of Union, unifying England and Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain. She was a ruler of consequence, but in her primary, gendered role, she was a catastrophic failure. She was a queen who ruled an expanding empire, but whose own body was a barren, broken kingdom. Her life was the ultimate paradox, a story of immense public success built upon a foundation of absolute personal and dynastic ruin. She was left utterly alone, the last of her line, a monarch consumed by a grief so profound it had extinguished the future itself. From the absolute abyss of despair, from the suffocating silence of a dead-end dynasty as seen in the life of Queen Anne, the human spirit can either shatter completely, dissolving into the dust of history, or it can undergo a final, terrible transmutation. Grief, when compressed under the immense pressure of a lifetime of sacrifice, can crystallize into something else entirely, a diamond-hard, incandescent rage. It is the defiance of the damned, the last battle fought by a soul with nothing left to lose. After witnessing the quiet endurance, the monumental sorrow, the ruthless political maneuvering, and the ultimate biological futility, we arrive at the final evolution of our archetype. This is the queen who has fulfilled her biological duty to an almost supernatural degree, only to realize that producing the heirs is not the end of the war, but merely the first battle. The true, final conflict is for control of the future she has so painfully birthed. This is the climax of our story, embodied in the ferocious will of a woman who birthed a nation's worth of children, and then demanded the right to rule their destiny. In the late 18th century kingdom of Kartli Kakheti, in what is now modern Georgia, Queen Darajan Dadiani, the second wife of King Erekle II, had achieved a feat of maternal endurance that bordered on the mythic. She had borne her husband 23 children. 23 times she had undergone the risks and agonies of childbirth, populating the palace with a sprawling dynasty of her own flesh and blood. She had performed her function with an abundance that dwarfed all others. But Darajan was no passive vessel. She was a woman of immense political cunning and ambition. She looked at her husband's firstborn son from a previous marriage, the heir apparent, Crown Prince George, and saw not a successor, but a threat to the legacy she had paid for with her own body. In her mind, her suffering had been an investment, and that investment now demanded a return. Her sons, she decided, would not be sidelined. They would rule. The court became her battlefield. Her whispers were her weapons, with relentless, calculated pressure. She embarked on her final campaign. It was not a war of swords, but of ink, whispers, and wills. She persuaded the aging, ailing King Erekle to defy centuries of tradition, to set aside the sacred law of primogeniture. In a secret, radical act, he signed a new will. The line of succession was changed. It would no longer pass directly to his firstborn, but would instead pass to Darajan's eldest son after George's death, and thenceforth would pass between the two competing branches of the family. It was a desperate, brilliant gambit to ensure her bloodline would inherit the throne. When King Ericl died in 1798, the will was revealed. The kingdom fractured instantly. Crown Prince George. Now, King George refused to recognize the new law. He saw it for what it was, a power grab by his ambitious stepmother. The court split into warring factions. Darajan's sons rallied their supporters, plotting against their half-brother. The kingdom, already weakened by external threats from Persia and the Ottoman Empire, turned on itself. The conflict was vicious, personal, and public. Darajan, the matriarch, stood at the center of this political firestorm, her fierce maternal devotion having become a catalyst for civil war. She had fought to control her children's fate, but in doing so, she had lit the funeral pyre of the kingdom itself. But the fire of one woman's ambition, no matter how fiercely it burns, cannot hold back the cold, inexorable tide of geopolitics. A house divided against itself cannot stand, and the vultures were already circling. The bitter infighting between Darajan's sons and King George XII paralyzed the Georgian state, leaving it exposed and vulnerable. Seeing an opportunity in the chaos, the vast, powerful Russian Empire to the north began to exert its influence, offering itself as a protector and mediator in the dispute. It was a classic imperial maneuver. The arrival of Russian envoys, and then troops, was not seen at first as a conquest, but as a necessary intervention to restore order. It was a fatal miscalculation. The dust from Darajan's furious political battle began to settle, not upon a victory for her sons, but upon the death of her nation's sovereignty. In 1801, following the death of the tormented King George XII, Russia made its move. Citing the political instability that Darajan herself had engineered. Tsar Paul, I officially abolished the Georgian monarchy and annexed the kingdom into the Russian Empire. The Bagrationi dynasty, one of the oldest Christian dynasties in the world, was extinguished with the stroke of a pen. The consequences for Darajan were swift and brutal. She, the Queen Mother, the architect of the conflict, was stripped of all power and titles. She was forcibly exiled to St. Petersburg, a prisoner of the state she had inadvertently invited into her home. Her life, once a whirlwind of power and maternal ambition, was reduced to a slow, humiliating fade into obscurity. She spent her final years in a gilded cage, under constant surveillance in a cold foreign city, a world away from the homeland she had fought for. She died in 1807, a lonely, defeated old woman, haunted by the ghosts of the 23 children she had borne and the independent kingdom she had helped to destroy. Her final, desperate battle for control had resulted in the absolute loss of everything. And so, the story ends, not in victory, but with the quiet closing of a door on a life of immense, forgotten struggle. The journeys of these 7 women, Mumtaz, Charlotte, Eleanor, Anna, Maria Carolina, Anne, and Darajan are not separate, isolated tragedies. They are acts in a single, epic, and deeply human drama that has played out across centuries. They are chapters in the unwritten history of power. a history whose cost is almost always paid by the female body. To tell their stories is to do more than simply recount the lineage of kings or the dates of battles. It is to insist on remembering the hidden cost of history itself, to look beyond the marble monuments and the gilded crowns and see the human wound beneath. It is to understand that the womb, the very symbol of creation, was for these women a battlefield, a crucible, and often a tomb. Their legacies are as complex and varied as their lives. A tomb of breathtaking beauty that asks whether love can justify the consumption of a life. A city in a new world named for a queen who privately saw herself as a prisoner. A series of stone crosses that stand as silent monuments to a grief too vast for words. A powerful European dynasty revitalized by one woman's body, only to have that same body discarded once its purpose was served. A political map of Europe redrawn by a mother's ferocious ambition. A great nation born from the union of two kingdoms, overseen by a queen whose own dynasty died within her, and a kingdom erased from the map. A casualty of a mother's final, desperate fight for her children. These women were the biological architects of their age, their value measured in the heartbeats of fragile heirs. Their bodies, the fragile vessels upon which the ship of state sailed. They endured cycles of pregnancy that broke their bodies, and waves of grief that shattered their souls. And yet, they endured. They ruled. They plotted. They built. They loved. And they survived. Even when survival meant becoming something other than what they were. They were the lifeblood of empires. And like blood, they were spent in the service of a cause greater and far more ruthless than themselves. Let us remember them not as passive footnotes in the stories of great men, but as the protagonists of their own profound epics. For behind every crown, there is a wound that bore it, and behind every empire, there stands a mother exhausted, devoted, and all too often forgotten. So we see that history's grand narrative is often written in the ink of private sorrow. The stories of these women reveal a chilling paradox that the power of an empire, its stability, and its very future, was built upon the profound powerlessness of the individuals whose bodies were its first and most essential territory. Their sacrifice was the dark, fertile soil from which dynasties grew. It leaves us with a profound question, and I truly want to know your thoughts on this. What do you believe is the true legacy of these queens? Is it the empires they secured and the bloodlines they continued? Or is it their own personal story of resilience, the quiet strength they showed in the face of impossible, often cruel demands? Please share your perspective in the comments below. If these journeys into the complex, often shadowed corners of history and human nature are what you value, please consider taking a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It tells us that these stories matter, and it helps us to continue bringing them to you. Be sure to click the notification bell as well, so you never miss our next exploration into the past. And while you wait, perhaps you'd be interested in another story of royal duty and personal tragedy. We delve deep into the life of another fascinating figure in our video, The Private Sorrows of Empress Sisi of Austria. Thank you for joining us on this journey.